Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Elevating the Sparks, Exploring the World of Chassidus. I'm very excited today to learn together with you about a very, very holy tzaddik and a monumental Jewish thinker who certainly changed the world and whose influence is still felt very strongly today. And that is Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi. Apparently, I mispronounced that last word, Liadi, which was a town in Russia. But Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, otherwise known as the first Rebbe of Chabad. Let's begin. We're going to learn a little bit about his life. And the Rabbi Schneur Zalman is also known as the Baal HaTanya, and that is because of maybe his most famous work, his magnum opus, the Tanya, which is actually called Likutei Amarim, but it's often referred to as Tanya. We're going to learn a few pieces from that today as well. So let's dive right into it. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you, and we will begin. Schneur Zalman of Liadi. I see. I'm just going to wait for the PowerPoint to load as I share my screen. Hopefully that will not take too long. There we are. You should be able to see it now. As we've learned about very briefly, a brief review of the history of Chassidus. Chassidus was a movement which was started by the Baal Shem Tov, by Yisrael ben Elazar. He started it in the second half of the 18th century. He was from Ukraine, the Ukraine and what we know today, but it began to spread pretty rapidly. He was an incredibly influential figure. Rav Yisrael, the Baal Shem Tov, had a disciple who was known by the Maggid of Mezrich, Rav Dov Ber of Mezrich. Rav Dov Ber of Mezrich was really responsible for taking the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and beginning of movements. And he had a number of students who in their own right became the Rebbes, who in their own right started their own Hasidic sects. And we've learned about a number of these great leaders. We learned about Rav Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev last week. So one of his disciples was Rav Schneur Zalman of Liadi, and that's who we're going to learn about today. So a little bit about his life. Like many of the other students of the Maggid, he was not born Hasidic. He was not born with long payas and a long beard. Obviously, he was born as a baby, but he was not born to a Hasidic family. Although he was born to a rabbinic family, his family had a tradition that they were descendants of the Maharal of Prague. We heard of the Maharal of Prague? Maharal of Prague is a very influential thinker, particularly for Hasidic thought, a really revolutionary in Jewish thought, also the Gadol Hador of his time. And Schneur Zalman of Liadi was a descendant of the Maharal of Prague. So he was born in Russia. Apparently, the Maharal's family eventually moved to Russia. I don't know how to pronounce this town. So if someone wants to correct me afterward, that's fine. Vyazna, Russia. It's in central Russia. It's near Lubavitch. If you've heard of Lubavitch. And he was a real genius. As we'll see, many of the Hasidic rabbis were Torah scholars, but the Baal HaTanya might have been the first who was a bona fide gadol, a real giant. From a young age, he was known to be brilliant. Tradition has it that he mastered the Talmud at the age of 12. He had already written a commentary on all of the Torah by the age of 12. He even got into contact in his town with those who had studied mathematics and science, so he got to study those as well. At that time, he was taught by a Rabbi Yisachar Ber of Lubavitch. That was his Melamed at the time. And at the age of 12, the story goes that he had already learned so much at the age of 12 that this teacher no longer had anything to teach him. Pretty good for a 12-year-old. So at that point, his studies bring him to Vitebsk, another town in the area. And later, he marries a young woman named Sterna Siegel. We don't know too much about his wife. We also know about her is that she was from a very wealthy family. Her father's name was Yehuda Leib Siegel, who was a very wealthy man. And so he had this young genius son-in-law, and this allowed Rabbi Schneur Zalman to devote all of his time to learning. And he really studied and became a Torah giant. He wasn't well known yet, but he was a real master of Talmudic law. Okay. So when does it become a chassid? So this is the fateful moment, as tradition has it. At the age of 20, he decides he wants to leave Vitebsk with the permission of his wife. He wants to leave Vitebsk. He wants to devote even more time to studying. He wants to really take the next step in his learning. So he had a choice at the time. His dilemma was as follows. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to go to Vilna or to Mezrich. Now, if you've been with us for the last few weeks, these were two very divergent paths. Vilna was, of course, the home of the Vilna Gaon. Vilna was the center of Lithuanian Talmudic scholarship. It was where all the greatest Lithuanian scholars learned. It was obviously the realm of the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna. And obviously, the students of the Vilna Gaon and the scholars there were opposed to Chassidus. Mezrich was where the Maggid of Mezrich was. The Maggid of Mezrich was the primary student of the Baal Shem Tov, which was the home of Chassidus. And he was deciding where to go. This young, budding scholar, Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi. He wasn't of Liadi yet, he was in Vitebsk, and he didn't know where to go. And apparently, he decided ultimately to go to Mezrich. As the story has it, the reason he decided to do that was because he said, I know how to learn already. I'm already very familiar with the Talmud. What I need to learn how to do is to learn how to daven. To learn how to daven, he went to Mezrich, which was the home of Hasidus. And he became a student of the Maggid of Mezrich. Legend has it, like with many of the other Hasidim, originally he was not particularly impressed with the Maggid of Mezrich, or Dover Mezrich. But before he left to go back home, he met with him one last time. The Maggid made eye contact with him. He saw in him something great. He started to teach him some of the secrets of Kabbalah. This got Rabbi Schneur Zalman hooked, and he becomes a student of the Maggid of Mezrich. And this was a real budding Torah scholar that became a student of the Maggid of Mezrich. So the Maggid saw a greatness within him, and his son, who was known as Avram Hamala, from Avram the angel, due to his lofty spiritual status, he was assigned to teach Rabbi Schneur Zalman the secrets of Chassidus, to really inaugurate him and incorporate him into this movement. And so it went, and Rabbi Schneur Zalman became a chassid of the Maggid of Mezrich, and he returns to Vitebsk after becoming a real chassid. Now, as we've learned, at that time, there was a lot of opposition to Chassidus. And like the others we've mentioned, like Rav Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev, like Rav Yaakov Yosef Polanoye, when he returns back to his town as a Chassid, he's driven out. He's driven out. The opposition to Chassidus was so intense and so strong that he can no longer stay in Vitebsk, and he has to go back to his hometown of Vyazma. This was the life of an early Hasidic rabbi. So he stays in touch with the Maggid of Mezrich. Maggid of Mezrich saw in Schneur Zalman an incredible Talmud Chacham. And this is where we begin to learn about how great he really was. Has anyone heard of Shulchan Aruch? Here. Shulchan Aruch? I hope so. Shulchan Aruch is, of course, the code of Jewish law. It's our basic guidebook to halacha, right? You have a question, you look it up in the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch was written in when? Anyone know? Which century? Shulchan Aruch? Who wrote the Shulchan Aruch?
Joseph Caro.
By Yosef Karo. Yosef Karo was
in Svat.
Who was lived in Egypt and then ultimately moved to Safat, Eretz Israel. He lived in the 16th century, and that's when the Shulchan Aruch was written. This is a good 200 years later. What the Maggid of Mezrich assigned Rabbi Schneur Zalman to do is to write a new, more concise, updated version of the Shulchan Aruch. That's what he assigned him to do. That was his mission. So you're taking a very, a large volume, which covers four different parts of Shulchan Aruch, pretty expansive. And now there's been 200 years since. So you can imagine 200 years since there's been new questions that were asked, new halachic rulings, new customs that have developed, particularly for the Hasidic world. And Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi's mission was to take that whole work and to summarize it and to make it more concise and to update it based on what had happened in 200 years since. And that's what Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi did. And he wrote what is now called the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Shulchan Aruch Harav, that is a work which is studied in all circles, not just in Chabad or Hasidic circles, but also in any yeshiva circles. And if you have a question, you might look it up in the Shulchan Aruch Harav. It's an important halachic source. So you get a hint to how great this Rabbi Schneur Zalman Liadi was as a Talmudic scholar and halachic expert, in that this was his mission, and he summarized the whole Shulchan Aruch. Or a monumental work. That's in the realm of exoteric Jewish learning. In the realm of esoteric Jewish learning, in the realm of mysticism and Kabbalah, a lot later, Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, main magnum opus, as I said, the Tanya. He's called the Baal HaTanya because he wrote the Tanya. He actually refers to it as Likutei Amarim, which means literally a collection of statements, not necessarily the catchiest title. It's often called the Tanya, if you've heard of Tanya, because of the first word. The Tanya begins with the word Tanya. Tanya means it was taught in a rabbinic tradition. So that's the first word, but he writes the Tanya. The Tanya, as we'll study a little bit together tonight, was a monumental work and also a very controversial work. As we'll learn a little bit more about in just a moment, but it's a systematic presentation of the Hasidic system. It's not just many Hasidic works are divrei Torah on the Parsha, right? Divrei Torah on the Parsha, they're sort of scattered. So you have one Parsha, and you have one idea on that, and one idea on this, and one idea on that. And if you read the entire work, if you read the Sfas Emes or the Kedushas Levi or any of these other Hasidic works on the Torah, you read it every week, you get a hint to the method, the thoughts, the mahalach. Tanya is much more systematic. It's not on Parsha. It is a systematic presentation of the Hasidic perspective on Torah and mitzvos, on Jewish life. And it is a metaphysical presentation of how Torah and mitzvot affect a spiritual reality. And maybe most controversially, it is a presentation of Kabbalah, like the Zohar and the Eitz Chaim, works written by obviously the Zohar is earlier, but then written afterward by the Ari HaKadosh, Yitzhak Gloria, and his students. He presented them in a way such that they would be accessible to a wide audience, which is a very controversial thing to do. And like any controversial book written in Judaism, there is much opposition. So we'll get to that. So you see then, the Schneur Zalman of Liadi was both a genius in Nigla and Nistar, in esoteric and exoteric wisdom, an absolute Torah giant. As such, he was probably well respected, you could imagine, probably venerated in the community, must have had a wonderful life. Not so fast. Schneur Zalman of Liadi, like many of these great Hasidic heroes, had a lot of strife in his life. So let's review some of that. Some of this, and this is all well known. We mentioned a few weeks ago that Vilna Gaon, who was the Gadol Hador, absolute genius and master of all areas of Torah, banned Chassidus. He excommunicated the Hasidim from the community, which was a very challenging thing. The Rav Schneur Zalman of Liadi and Rav Nachman Mendel of Vitebsk, who was also one of the Baal HaTanya's teachers and mentors after the Maggid HaMedrash passed away. Rav Nachman Mendel of Vitebsk was his Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya's Rebbe. Either way, both of them, they lived in the same region. They both went to visit the Vilna Gaon. They wanted to make peace with the Vilna Gaon. Here you have Rav Schneur Zalman of Liadi, an absolute Gaon, a Talmudic scholar, So the Pope was, by talking to them and showing the Vilna Gaon that they weren't a bunch of crazies and they weren't heretics. They were real Talmidei Chachamim who believed in a certain approach to Judaism and wanted to practice and connect to God in this way. They would convince the Vilna Gaon to reverse his ban on Hasidus. And so they made a trip to Vilna to go see the Vilna Gaon. They were not received. They never met him. They were not let into his house. Some suggest the Vilna Gaon ran away from Vilna when they went to go see him. It never happened. And the excommunication, the ban, was not reversed. So that's one thing you see. A year later, after this happens, Rabbi Mendel of Vitebsk, again, now the Rebbe of the Baal Tanya, goes to Israel. He makes a big pilgrimage to Israel, and he brought many of his followers to go live in Israel, ultimately in Safat. Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi wanted to follow him to Israel with a number of his followers as well, but he was begged to stay. So after beginning this pilgrimage, he stops. He stops going, and he ends up going back to his hometown of Liazna. Okay, so this is now 20 years later after the Tanya is published. When the Tanya was published, there was a lot of opposition to it. And one of the people who was opposed to it was Rabbi Avraham Kalisker. Rabbi Avraham Kalisker was another student of Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, and at that moment in time was the head of Chassidus in Israel. And he denounced the Baal Tanya for writing Tanya. Why? His claim was that the Baal Tanya, what the Baal Tanya was trying to do was almost unnecessary. That is to say, that the Baal Shem Tov had already, I guess, made his presentation of Kabbalistic concepts, and he had already revealed them in a way which is more accessible to the Hasidic public, the world at large. And that was after the Ariya Kadosh. What the Baal Tanya was doing was combining the teachings, the primary teachings of Kabbalah with the Baal Shem Tov specific approach. And Rabbi Avraham Kalisker felt that combining teachings of the Ariya Kadosh and the Baal Shem Tov wasn't necessary, and he felt the Tanya did not have the right to do so, and he felt the Tanya should not have made these very primary texts of Kabbalah accessible to a large audience. That wasn't the way of the Baal Shem Tov, and he said, "Who says you're doing this in the right way? You have no right to do this." The Baal Shem Tov already, taught in his way. He never specifically linked to these Kabbalistic sources. You have no right to do this. What you're doing is wrong. And Rabbi Avraham Kalisker suggested that the copies of Baal Tanya be buried. He wanted to bury them. Now, at this time, Rabbi Avraham Kalisker didn't know this, but by 1796, the Baal Tanya had quite a following already. He had tens of thousands of Hasidim, and he was already powerful in his own right. So this caused a huge machlokes, a huge rift. And to add to it, the Hasidic Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael needed support. They needed support from the European Hasidim, the Hasidim of Poland and Russia. And so they needed people to go and get donations and to send them funds. Well, wouldn't you know it? Who was one of the primary Hasidic masters responsible for sending funds, collecting and sending funds to the Hasidim in Eretz Yisrael? The Baal Tanya, Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, whom Rabbi Avraham Kalisker in Eretz Yisrael had just suggested that his book should be banned. So this created a huge controversy. Again, I'm not an expert on the history here, but you could read about it. There are different works written about this controversy. But this was a huge controversy between the Hasidim of Russia and the Hasidim of Eretz Yisrael. It might have even torn the whole movement apart, if not for the efforts of those like Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev and Rav Nachman of Breslov, who attempted, through a lot of their efforts and reaching both sides, in efforts to stop the machlokas. But this was another huge controversy for the Baal Tanya. His work, the Tanya, was there was an attempt to ban it. It didn't work. And the Tanya became very popular, and it was widely disseminated. So that's good, isn't it? But once the Tanya was widely disseminated, Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, the Baal Tanya, became seen as the head of the Hasidic movement in Russia. And once he was the head of the Hasidic movement in Russia, he became the target of many of the Misnagdim, those who opposed the Hasidic movement. And it got really bad. So much so that they informed on him. To the Tsar that he was spreading heresy, that the Baal Tanya was, through his efforts where he was channeling funds to different communities, he was rebelling, and he was imprisoned twice. He was imprisoned 2 separate times by the Russian government, by the Tsar. 2 separate times. Once in 1798, and then again in 1800. Each time when the Tsar actually met him, they released him, and they were very impressed with him personally. But there was a change of authority, and he was arrested 2 different times. One of those times, the first time, happened on the 19th of Kislev. And to this day, the day in which the Alter Rebbe was released from prison is a holiday in Chabad. It's a holiday of Yotes Kislev. It's seen as God's, Hashem's Geshpanka, Hashem's seal, that the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and after in the Baal Tanya would ultimately be revealed. Legend has it that while he was in prison, the Baal Tanya was obviously, sort of discouraged, and both the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid of Mezrich appeared in a dream. He asked them, should I stop what I'm doing? Should I stop disseminating my teachings? And they said, no, absolutely not. You need to continue doing it with even more strength. And so Yotes Kislev became a holiday. Where it's almost as if to say God redeemed Chassidus and allowed its teachings to spread. So at this point, after released the second time, he's invited by Prince Stanislav to settle in Liadi. The last 12 years of his life, he lives in Liadi, which is why he's known as Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, in case you were guessing. And at this point, those were his last 12 years. In 1812, another monumental event happened. Napoleon, French monarch, invades Russia. At that moment in time, there was a big controversy as to which side to associate with in this war, the Tsar or Napoleon. And there were a number of Jewish leaders and Hasidic masters on each side. In fact, I'm not going to get the story. There's a story, I think, forgive me if you look it up. Forgive me if I tell it incorrectly. There's a story that Levi Yitzchak Barditchev and the Baal Tanya were both reading for different sides. The Baal Tanya wanted Napoleon to lose, and the Kedushas Levi wanted Napoleon to win, if I remember this correctly. So it was Rosh Hashanah. In Rosh Hashanah of that year of 1812, of course, everything is decreed that year. So what are we going to do? So the thought was, whoever gets to Unisana Tokef first wins, right? If you get once one of the Rebbes gets to Unisana Tokef and the prayers go up to Shomayim, for sure, the side that they're associating with is going to win. So the story goes, the Baal Tanya sort of rushed the field a little bit. We have to get to Unisana Tokef. And the Kedushas Levi began with Unisana Tokef instead of waiting until Musaf. He started the Unisana Tokef. That's how the story goes, if I remember correctly. Either way, Schneur Zalman of Liadi sided against Napoleon. One theory is, and there's a letter to this effect from the Alter Rebbe to one of his students, saying that he rooted against Napoleon because Napoleon wanted emancipation, freedom of religion, and the Schneur Zalman of Liadi felt, although it would certainly mean a greater material and financial situation for the Jews to leave the ghettos and to have more opportunity, he was afraid about the spiritual repercussions. He was afraid that they would assimilate and their spiritual status would sink. And for that, he felt better to stay with the Tsar and be poor, but be to ourselves and retain our faith. That was his feeling. He was someone, I should say, who definitely did his best to care for the material needs of his congregants, of his Hasidim, and he encouraged people to move to certain areas where there was more opportunity. And when there were bans against farmers, he raised funds to help different Jewish farmers, etc. But at that moment, he felt that spiritual success and vitality overtakes the importance of material vitality. Well, as you may know, Napoleon won. And when that happened, he feared for his life. So he fled Liadi, and he was running to the interior of Russia as Napoleon began to advance. And during that flight, he died. That apparently that efforts at his age to run away from Napoleon and run away from the war took a toll on him physically, and he died in a place called Pien. And here you have a picture of his kever in Russia. It is, you can, although Russia is not a simple place to go, but we have a site there to this day. But so let's end off the biography part. The Baal Tanya left quite a legacy. The Baal Tanya had tens of thousands of Hasidim in his lifetime. He was known as a scholar and a teacher. One thing the Baal Tanya you can distinguish between him and other Rebbes is that he was less of a Baal Moifes, less of a miracle worker, and more of a teacher. Less of and he demanded more from the Hasidim. I'm not going to make you close to God, but I'm going to teach you how you can do it. And he generally more of an intellectual movement, as we will soon see, than other Hasidus. But he was known, and his legacy today remains as a teacher, a man of the people, a collector of tzedakah, an advocate for his community, an absolute gon and tzaddik. And he had a huge Hasidus, which is succeeded by his son, Rav Dov Ber, the second Rebbe of Chabad. You may know, if you've heard of Lubavitch, his son ultimately moves to Lubavitch, and that begins the real Chabad dynasty and Hasidus. So much the biography part. Now let's learn a little bit about the Tanya himself, the Baal Tanya. Now, you may be wondering, it's called Chabad Hasidus. Why is it called Chabad Hasidus? So to understand that, we have to learn a little bit of Tanya. And here is an important point to make specifically about his contribution. You may be sort of familiar with a certain perspective on contrasting Hasidim to Misnagdim or Litvash, right? Classically, people assume that the Misnagdish, the Lithuanian movement, is much more intellectual, much more interested in learning and learning Gemara and learning Halacha and becoming Torah scholars. And the Hasidic movement is much more emotional and spiritual and focused on singing and dancing and feeling close to Hashem. So that to some degree is certainly true, but Chabad's a bit different. The primary argument of Chabad is that everything starts with Chabad, Chachma, Bina, and Das, which is, I guess you could translate as wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. But this notion that the everything flows from the intellect and from understanding flows from there to the emotions and ultimately to the way that we live. And what the Baal Tanya does in Hasidus and in the Tanya is something very radical. He connects this process with Kabbalah and with the spheros, with emanations, that when as God reveals himself in the world, that God obviously is beyond any comprehension, but there is a world, and Hashem slowly, we have this world because there's a transition from God in his, what we call in Hasidus Ayin, God in his unknowable self, unlimited, infinite self, slowly transitions to our physical world. So the argument is that happens through God's thought. The world is sort of God's idea. And there's a slow transition from, obviously, kivayachal, as it were, God's thought slowly to his attributes, and to the world that we have. And the Baal Tanya argues that that process takes place within humans as well, and is reflected that what we do in our minds and in our hearts is parallel to, in a sense, what Hashem does. So to try to understand that a little bit, I know it's very lofty, but I do think it can be very inspirational. What I'd like to do is learn two pieces of Tanya with you. I know it's late. We'll try to do, we won't read everything inside, but I'm going to share my screen. You should see this in front of you, and here we go. This is from the Tanya, as I mentioned, Likutei Amarim, the very beginning of it. Before we dive in, what the Baal Tanya has just described is the fact that we are made of souls, and there are really, although we often think of one soul, there are really three levels of the soul. There's nefesh, ruach, neshama. The soul is from God himself. God places a part of himself, as it were, in every human being. But the way that works is a slow, gradual descent. A slow, gradual descent from God's essence, as it were, into our human bodies. And there are three levels of soul, and each one of them is a little bit lower downward until you get to the one in the human body. That's sort of the introduction. It's also worth reading. That's in the first and second part of this work. But now we're going to jump into here, because this is where Chabad comes from. Here we go. He says, every single distinction and grade of these three souls, nefesh, ruach, neshama, our souls are made up of 10 different faculties. Kineged eser spirot elyonot, wow, which correspond to God's 10 emanations. So while God has these 10 spirot, as it were, we also have 10 different aspects to ourselves. Radical idea. And he says, and those 10 are connected through two different subdivisions. Though two different divisions, these 10 attributes are divided into the three mothers and the 7 multiples. The 7 are also 7 sefirot, and he's going to explain what they are. Pirish, Chachma, Bina, V'dat. That's Chabad. Chachma, Bina, and Dat are the emotes. Again, as this is obviously all a mashal, but as it were, those represent God's thought, God's system of thought. And then the Shiva Yemei Binyan, the 7 days of creation, which are Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus. You've heard of the Sefirot. They are, again, it's hard to sort of describe them so briefly, but I don't want to focus on them. I want to focus on heaven and us. But these are the 7 ways in which God reveals himself so that there is a world. So here it goes. Here's the point, though. So too in each person. We are divided into two. We have spiritual forces inside of ourselves divided into two parts. Seichel umidot. We have our seichel, our intellect, and our midot, our attributes, our emotional attributes. Seichel kolel chachma bina vadat. Our intellect includes 3 different parts: chachma, bina, and dat. You could say, and he'll explain what those are. And then midot are attributes: avat Hashem, love of God, pachto, b'yirato, ulefaro. All our emotional attributes: fear of God, love of God, or awe of Him. He doesn't really explicate what all those 7 are. But we have 7 attributes, parallel to God's 7 attributes, and we, in our minds, is parallel to God's thought. And he explained what that means. Chachma is the first step in intellectual comprehension. So the very first spark, our cognition, the intellect of the rational soul, which begins to think about something. You have an idea, you have a spark of inspiration in your mind. The very first spark, when you begin to think, that is chokhmah. It comes from the word koach ma. Koach ma means some force, some idea. It's the very beginning of the intellectual process. You have this inspiration. Ukishemotzi kocho el hapoel. When you take that thought, that again, sort of amorphous idea in your mind, and you begin to think about it and to define it and to actualize it. When you think about this idea and you try to understand it and to define its parameters and to really get into the depth of it. That's the second step. Bina. Bina is the second step of taking this inspiration and crystallizing it and beginning to understand it and to rationalize it and to think about it. These two ideas, Chachma and Bina, this sort of method of contemplation, are the father and mother for the love and fear of God. That's an important line. So what he's going to explain further is that love of God, right? That's our goal. We want to feel close to God. We want to love God. We want to feel like God's a presence in our lives. We want to feel in awe of him. Want to be aware of him. Where does that come from? It doesn't come from singing. It doesn't come from dancing. It comes from contemplation. It comes from our intellect, our brain, our chachma, and bina. And he explains how. Ki yirato, excuse me, one second. Ki hasechal shenefesh hamisakelet. How does this happen? He explains how this should actually happen. When a person's intellect conceives and thinks, when a person contemplates deeply about the greatness of God, you have to really think about it and think about what it means that there's a God in the world. And what about it? How he fills all the world and surrounds all the world, which are phrases used to describe both God's immanence and transcendence, how God is beyond all comprehension and is the force behind everything in existence, but is also somehow accessible. Somehow we can pray to him. And everything is like nothing in front of it. When a person thinks about what that means, that there is such a force, there's a God that fills everything, that is beyond all comprehension, that gives life to everything in the universe, that is the force beyond everything that exists, and everything is nothing to that, then what should happen, what should result from that contemplation, from thinking about that, and contemplating that, what should result is, then there should be born and awakened within the person an awe of his greatness. That should result in a feeling, not just a thought, but like, oh my goodness, I'm in the presence of the Mimale Kolame, God who fills all the world. To fear and to be in awe of his greatness that has no end. A person should be already afraid. Oh my gosh, I'm in the presence of this omnipresent, unlimited being. And then afterward, and this follows the order of the Rambam in Yesodei HaTorah, after a person has that cognizance and that awareness and that fear, then is awakened within him a passionate love, like fire. V'chashika v'chapitza utshuka v'nefesh shokeka, with a yearning and a desire and a soul that yearns, like Dula Saint So Baruch Hu, for that greatness. I want some of that greatness. I want to be close to that. Once a person has this very powerful thought and understanding and contemplation in their mind, all of a sudden that will lead to an awe and a love. V'hi kalot hanefesh, that is the yearning of the soul, as we write K'niksiv in Tehillim, Nixta pavagam kol sanafshi, that my soul yearns and pines. Samanafshi Elokim, my soul thirsts for God. Samalachanafshi, that is the feeling that this is describing. Ushar hamidos kulos tein anfe hayira va'ava b'tolosein. All of the other midos, compassion and kindness, all of the other midos flow from love and awe. So there's a process happening here A process that begins with contemplation and thinking and understanding, which gives birth to love and fear, which express themselves in all the attributes. It's a process of creation in a sense that flows from a source, which parallels the process of creation of the world, as it were, which also flows from God's thoughts. So that's Chachma and Bina. What's Das? Chachma and Bina is contemplation. What's Das? Das is from the language of Adam Yada and Chava. Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve. It says Adam had known Chava. What does it mean Adam had known Chava? Not that he understood that there was a woman named Chava. He knew that before. It means intimately. He knew her intimately. It describes intimacy. So Dat is intimate knowledge. It implies a connection. It is a language of tying oneself to something and connecting to it. There's one thing to understand something. It's one thing to know something. It's an entirely different thing to internalize that idea, to tie one's mind to the idea, to bind one's thinking, one's entire intellectual faculty to an idea, so it's stuck to their mind, that's etched inside their consciousness. That a person binds their mind with a very strong bond. And inserts their thoughts with great strength about the greatness of God. That's supposed to be etched into our consciousness, this contemplation and understanding of the greatness of God. And they don't get distracted. Again, this is obviously a very lofty level to strive for. But maybe we could try. Maybe we could try for a few moments. Maybe before davening, maybe on Shabbat, maybe on Yom Kippur. Just try for a few moments to think and contemplate the greatness of God, and do it again and again and again to the point you actually feel something. You feel an emotion. You feel an appreciation and a love and an awe. And he explains the need for this. I'm sorry, the English doesn't exactly match up to the Hebrew here, but even someone who is an incredibly bright, wise person, if he doesn't continuously connect his mind to that which he knows and understands, and maybe there's a little critique of the Misnagdim here. Maybe there's a little bit of a critique of the Lithuanian Talmudists who might know a lot, but do they make sure to connect, to think again and again, consistently about what they know, such that it becomes part of them? If you don't do that, then you will not have this true fear and love in your soul. You have to really continuously think about it. You have to make it part of it, to connect to it. They'll just have false illusions. It won't be real. Yeah, you're thinking about it, but is it really part of you? For that, you have to have das. Das, this connective knowledge or connective cognition, is what sustains our attributes, what sustains love and fear and all the different midos. And it includes kindness and gevura, strength or power. Pirish ahava v'afel v'yira v'nafel, right? Which is to say that all the different outgrowths of love and fear. That was one piece of Tanya. And I hope I'm still with you. I know it's late. I'll probably describe the next part outside. But the piece is a description of Chabad, Chachma, Bina, and Dat. That is the name of the movement. It's called Chabad Chassidus because of how fundamental this idea is. The idea of this process of cognition, of contemplation of God and his greatness, and consistently contemplating that till it becomes a part of a person's soul and a part of their consciousness, and leads to these feelings of love and fear. and all the other midos, which is to say, it's not that the Baal Tanya is saying, taking away from the emotional aspect of our relationship with God, but he's arguing it has to be rooted in the intellectual appreciation and understanding and concentration on God's greatness. That is the source of true love and fear of God. If you're just singing and dancing and you're saying, I love Hashem, but it doesn't come from actually contemplating God's greatness, and that's not true ahava and yira. That's what he's arguing. Now, he said, he ends the end here that this ends with ahava and yira, which are the source of everything. So let's read a few more lines in the next piece to describe how this goes even more practical, on a practical level, how this should affect everything, all the Torah mitzvahs that we do. He says, every soul, which he's described at this point, has three different garments. Our souls have garments. What are the garments? Shemashava, Dibor, Umasa. Thought, speech, and act. Shataryag mitzvahs Torah. Of the 613 mitzvahs of Torah. When a person does all the action mitzvahs, all the practical actions God demands of us. Uvedibor, who osek beperish kol tarag mitzvah v'chotein. And with his speech, he speaks out and discusses the explanation of all the mitzvahs. Uvemachshava, and in his thought. He understands with his thought the explanation of the mitzvahs of the Torah. And on a simple level, on a deeper level, he understands. Right? Ooh, this is a little bit of a repetition. Sorry. 1 second. Okay. So then, Shaarei, with a person's thought, speech, and actions. Shaarei, klolos taryag evare nafsho milubashim v'taryag mitzvah Torah. That then means all 613 of his limbs become dressed in the mitzvahs. When I do a mitzvah, not just an act, but that mitzvah encapsulates me. My limbs become dressed with that mitzvah. It becomes a garment for me. Specifically, Bechinas Chachma Bina Das Benasho, the Chabad. Again, Chabad, just to reiterate how radical this is. Chabad in Kabbalah represents the root, if you could say such a thing, the root attributes of God. They represent God's thoughts. And he's using those same terms to describe our process of thought, which parallels God's thought. Incredible idea. V'frata, Bechinas Chachma Bina Das Benasho, the Chabad in a person's soul. Melubashos Ba'sagas HaTorah Shu Masig B'nefesh V'shat Remes Drusod. A person's mind becomes dressed with the ideas of Torah that they understand. Based on a person's understanding, capacity, and the root of their soul above. Because part of our soul is above. Part of our soul is not in this world. It's above, in an upper world, by God's Kitzi HaKavod, which is connected to our soul in this world. And so when we understand the Torah, we're connecting to God in a very intimate way. V'hamidos, shehein, hayira va'ava v'anfein v'al saying a person's attributes, the person's love and their fear and all their emotions. Those emotions and those attributes get dressed with the fulfillment of the mitzvot with speech and action. Love of God, which is our attribute, our midah, is the root of all the positive mitzvot. So if I want to do, what's going to get me to make Kiddush on Shabbos? Think of positive mitzvot, Kiddush on Shabbos, or davening, or doing chesed, or whatever, taking the lulav, blowing the shofar, all that. What is the root of that? What's the root of that mitzvah? What the root has to be love of God. a person is meant to be inspired by their love of God, then go be active and do mitzvos. Without that love of God, you're missing part of the mitzvah. You're missing the boat. It's not random arbitrary acts. They're meant to be acts inspired by Ahavas Hashem. Someone who fully, truly fulfills the mitzvah, who obey Hashem Hashem, is the one who loves the name of God. And wants to cleave to him. The who cannot truly cleave to God without doing the 248 positive mitzvos, which are like the 248 limbs of the king. God is giving you part of himself by giving you the mitzvos. By doing them, you're connecting with him. The Yira, he shorish l'shasa Yira is the root of the 365 negative mitzvos. So when I avoid doing averot, I don't do malacha on Shabbat, and I don't eat non-kosher, and I don't say lashon hara, and I watch what I eat and I watch what I say. What is inspiring me to do that? Another one of my attributes. That's the attribute of the fear of God. I don't want to rebel against him. I don't want to contravene his commandments. Oh, you're a pnimit nizu, even better than that. Where I have such a cognizance of God's greatness, I'm embarrassed. You think I'm going to do an Avera Hashem? I'm embarrassed to do such a thing in front of the Melech Malchim Malchim. Right in front of his eyes. All the evil things that he despises. Which in the metaphysical system, the sins are not just, again, acts, but there's a negative spiritual energy attached to them. Because there's negative spiritual forces and positive spiritual forces. And the Averos come from a negative spiritual force. Okay, they come from this lower man. We have two souls. There's an animalistic soul. And it's the animalistic soul that wants to do Averos. And when we do Averos, we're attaching this negative spiritual energy. We're becoming more animalistic, and we're distancing ourselves from God. And Yira is there to say, I don't want that. Yira, fear, is there to say, I don't want to distance myself from God. I don't want to rebel against him. Point is, V'hinei, even these three clothings, the three garments, i.e., Dibor, Machshava, and Maset, speech, action, and thought, even though they're called clothing for the soul, in Kozeh Gava v'Gada Malasam Le'in Kates v'Sofa Malas Nefesh Ruch Neshama Atzman, they're even greater than the soul themselves. Kimosha Kasav Zohar, Deoraisa v'Kutcha Brecha Kulachai. God is one with the Torah. The Torah and God are one. Pirish. Deoraita hi chachma ritzono shakadosh baruch hu. The Torah is God's will and wisdom. V'akadosh baruch hu b'kvodo v'asa kulachad. And God is totally one. So if the Torah is God's wisdom and God's will, then the Torah is, in a sense, God. It's an expression of God's will, which is like God himself, because God is totally one, total unity. As those of you with me learn with the Rambam with me, it says, God is his knowledge. He's not indivisible. And what does that mean? Even though God is limitless, he's infinite. There's no limit to his greatness. But let Mashavat speak to be called, and we can't comprehend him. And so his wisdom. And all these different psukim saying there's no way we can comprehend God. God's wisdom is so expansive, it's beyond us, it's so vast. Nevertheless, he said regarding this, the makom wherever you find God's greatness, you find his humility. What does it mean for God to be humble? It means he made himself accessible. God makes himself accessible through the mitzvot. God constricted his will and his wisdom. V'taryag mitzvot haTorah u'behilchotayen v'tzirufe otiot Torah neviim u'ksuvim. He took his infinite will and his wisdom, constricted it, and placed it and contained it within the mitzvot and the Torah. All the Gemara and the Mishnah and the Torah and the mitzvot contains the wisdom of God, and it encapsulates the wisdom of God, which is God in his humility constricted his unlimited wisdom into our Torah. So that our souls in our bodies can comprehend them. God wanted us to comprehend his wisdom, which is him, and so he constricted himself so that we could do so. And he wanted us to be able to fulfill his will with our speech, thought, and action. And through doing this, and through doing the mitzvot, we can dress every element of our being, our thought, our emotions, our speech, our actions, our thoughts with God. We're dressing them with God. That's the radical claim of the Baal Tanya. So I know it was a lot, but to sort of summarize very briefly, the Baal Tanya is arguing here, which is a really radical idea that can transcend, or no, that's not the right word, that can define an entire system of religion. What he's saying is that we are integrally connected to God. We have a soul that is connected to God. And our system of thought is parallel to God's system of thought. And our attributes are parallel to God's attributes. And when we think about God, and we have, through that contemplation, developed this love and fear of him in a real, sincere way, and that expresses itself in doing mitzvah, in learning Torah, in davening, in talking about the mitzvos, we are unifying in such an intimate way with God himself, because God constricted himself within the Torah, and we, with our mind, our thought, and our deed, can incorporate the Torah into ourselves. And that is an incredible union. So that is what Chabad stands for. I hope that you found that inspirational.
Ooh.
That is a lot to think about, but
That's a lot to absorb in 1 hour.
And we'll continue to discuss some practical aspects of that with Chazi Freund